I'm Eric Lee, Director of the Kimball Art Museum. Welcome to the inaugural lecture for Myth and Marble, Ancient Roman Sculpture from the Torlonia Collection. The Kimball is tremendously honored to be hosting this collection, which is the largest, most important private collection of ancient Roman sculpture in the world. The collection is legendary, not only because of its importance and the fact that it is the last of the princely collections of Rome, but also because it was stored away, unseen by all but a few people since World War II. Even specialists in ancient Roman art had not seen the collection until portions of it went on public view, first in Rome in 2020, and then at the Louvre in Paris last year. At the Kimball, we are tremendously grateful to the founders of the Torlonia Foundation, including its president, Alessandro Poma Morialdo, for sharing their treasures with the Kimball. I'd also like to thank Carlotta Lovarini Botta, director of the Torlonia Foundation, for all her work in bringing the exhibition to Texas. The organizing curator of the exhibition for the Kimball was our own Jennifer Kassler-Price, Senior Curator of Asian, African, and Ancient American Art. Jennifer did an amazing job with the exhibition, as she always does. A big thanks and congratulations to Jennifer, and indeed the entire Kimball staff for their magnificent work. Jennifer will shortly introduce today's speakers, but first I want to welcome Carlotta Lovarini Botta to the podium to tell us more about the Torlonia Foundation.
Good morning. Allow me to begin with to express my deepest gratitude to the Kimball Museum, to Kimball Wynne, to Eric Lee, the director, George Shackelford, the deputy director, whose vision and generosity have made possible for us to bring this masterpiece across the Atlantic to Texas, and to Jennifer Kassler-Price, the curator of Asian, African, and Ancient American art here at the Kimball, who has led this project with passion and erudition, shaping a lucid display that is not only profoundly thoughtful, but blend perfectly antiquity into the contemporary architecture of the Renzo Piano Pavilion that I wanted to show you. Allow me also to acknowledge the founders of Fondazione Torlonia, whose vision and foresight gave life to our mission and continue to guide us today. It is thanks to their legacy that the collection has entered a new season of study, preservation, and public sharing that give me the chance to introduce the foundation to all of you today. As a foundation, we are committed to sustain a systematic effort in the study and conservation of classical antiquity, with a mission to preserve and promote two extraordinary artistic heritages, the Torlonia Collection and Villa Albani Torlonia. As our president, Alessandro Poma Morialdo, often said, we were at the very beginning a startup. Nevertheless, we were managing these fantastic artistic heritages. But we are today, after 10 years, an international reality that is touring the collection around the world with a final goal to rebuild the Torlonia Museum in Rome, hopefully in few years. In doing so, we work to shape the foundation to meet both the needs of scholars and the demands of our modern times. And in doing so, we delve into history, into some of the most significant chapters of the Torlonia family. We return to 19th century, to the pivotal figure of Prince Alessandro Torlonia, who was born at the beginning of the 19th century and died in 1886. During his lifetime, he expanded the fortune of the family and embraced the rich and diverse artistic tradition that has converged within him, shaping and restoring it in a ways that spoke to his own time while ensuring its transmission also to future generations. Transitioning from a private collection, as it was common at the time, to a sort of public museum, establishing the Torlonia Museum in 1875, he marked a decisive shift in the nature of his already unique collection. transforming it into something far more visionary that paved the way to the modern institution of the public museum. But here we are today. Jason Farago, the art critic for the New York Times, recently described the U.S. exhibition as the most important exhibition of classical sculpture to visit the U.S. in a generation. And it is precisely this kind of generational shift the Torlonia Foundation hopes to spark. As we study and restore the Torlonia marble, we also aim to reintroduce to a new generation the relevance of the message that these sculptures carries and the extraordinary stories that they can tell us. The journey back into the spotlight, and especially over the past year, has been particularly significant for the Torlonia Collection. After the inaugural exhibition of the U.S. tour at the Chicago Art Institute, the collection traveled to Paris, to the Louvre Museum, where it was the most longest-running show and visited exhibition of the museum. Welcoming over 738,000 visitors, an exceptional result for which we extend our sincere thanks to Madame la Présidente Laurent Descartes and the curator Cécile Giroir, Martin Setsuik, Salvatore Settis, and Carlo Gasparri. After having remained out of the public view for decades, the Torlonia marbles have been rediscovered through a series of landmark exhibitions in some of the most prestigious institutions. We started with the exhibition at the Capitolini Museum in 2020 with an installment by David Chipperfield, and followed by the Galleria d'Italia in 2022. This was a fortunate series of exhibition because unluckily we had to open the exhibition at the Capitolini Museum during the pandemic, and so in Milan we felt that many more visitors had the chance to see the work. Then after that it was exhibition at the Louvre, but before the exhibition I would say the most important goal that the foundation had reached is the opening of the Laboratori Torlonia. The Laboratori Torlonia are the workshop for the restoration of all the 622 sculptures in the Torlonia collection. Contrary of some of the narrative, these laboratories were created near the reserve of the sculptures, where the collection has always been housed, basically in fewer of the 70 rooms that once composed the originally Torlonia Museum. To the date, we have completed the restoration of more than 150 sculptures with the long-standing support of Fondazione Bulgari. Each exhibition, and I have to thank the curator of each exhibition, has been for us the opportunity to foster and further study research restoration project. We started with more than 100 pieces from the core group of the inaugural exhibition in Rome in 2020 to having the chance to study and restore magnificent masterpieces such as the sarcophagus of the Via Ardeatina for the show at the Galleria d'Italia, and additionally 10 pieces for the exhibition at the Louvre Museum that wanted to foster a dialogue with the sculpture of Villa Albani Torlonia that are now housed at the Louvre Museum, and an impressive number of 28 sculptures for the US tour, 24 of which you can admire in the gallery today. For each work, a dedicated booklet is produced documenting the full restoration project, and this includes photographic and graphic records, detailed conservation reports, and analysis of material and execution technique. At the Art Institute, for the first time, this graphic material has been shown to the public, making a sensation and I think a deeper understanding for everyone on how these sculptures have been restored over the centuries. The work at the laboratory is a work that it starts with a deep study of what we have to restore, and depending on the condition of the marble, we use different cleaning methods. Here you can see the only bronze sculpture of the collection, the Germanicus, that has been probably the most difficult restoration that the laboratory has to go so far. The removal of the surface deposit has uncovered both aged patina and earlier restorations, some quite remarkable, such as the Bernini intervention of the statue of the resting goat, and also the surviving traces of color on the Porto's relief. And here you can see a drawing that documents how the Porto's relief looked back in the days. Just this month, I am very proud to say that we have completed a quite but very meaningful milestone, what they reinforced the foundation mission, the movement of over 450 Torlonia marbles as part of a complete reorganization of the reserve collection following modern archival standard. This initiative marks a major step forward in our ongoing commitment to conservation and documentation. So now we are ready to welcome scholars and study and more researches on the Torlonia collection. I'm not going to go through the history of the Torlonia collection that is well known. This impressive collection of marbles were gradually assembled through the series of acquisition, which is why we call it a collection of collection. The Cavaceppi Estate's core group of sculpture, then the Giustiniani, Marquis Giustiniani and Albani's collection, as well as numerous excavation projects. So that's why it became quite a collection of collection, a remarkable convergence of work that once has belonged to the greatest Roman noble family. So these sculptors found a new home in a former granary in Via della Lungara near Palazzo Corsini when Prince Alessandro Torlonia decided to found his museum. It was there that he made the visionary decision to open the Museo Torlonia. That was not a mere act of wealth accumulation, but an intentional and visionary gesture to create a lasting cultural legacy, one that would honor and transcend the aristocratic tradition of self-representation in Rome. His scholarly ambition was unmistakable, not only in the exceptional quality of the works that he displayed, but also in the production of the Torlonia Museum catalogue. An avant-garde for its time, both in concept and technique, phototype catalogue that reproduced the whole Torlonia collection in a way that it remains striking modern today, defining its boundaries once and for all and entrusting it to history. It was a statement, and it was freely distributed to the major institutions in Europe, in France and Italian. While it is well known that the Torlonia Museum closed during the Second World War, it is less well known that Prince Alessandro Torlonia, the grandfather of our presidents, so it is a little bit confusing because they are all called the same, but pursued three ambition project to reopen the Torlonia Museum. So immediately after the war in 1960, at the request of the military for security reasons due to the agitation during the post-war period, the collection was relocated to, some of the collection was relocated to the ground floor in Via della Lungara. And between the 16th and the 18th, Prince Alessandro proposed 3 new museum projects to permanently house the collection, creating a Museo Torlonia adjacent to Villa Albani Torlonia in Rome. But all were ultimately they didn't found the daylight during the institutional project. The Torlonia Foundation then was founded in 2024 by the same Prince Alessandro and our president, with the express aim to preserving and promoting both the Torlonia collection and Villa Albani Torlonia. So we can now jump to March 2024, that after 10 years where the Torlonia, since the founding of the foundation, we were able to celebrate the 10th anniversary and displays the collection because we felt it was essential to establishing a last dialogue with the city of Rome. And so to mark this moment, we opened a beautiful, small and meaningful exhibition for 15 restored works in the antiquarian space, the newly refurbished exhibition space in the historic stable of Villa Albani Torlonia that we are luckily about to expand to double for next year. The exhibition was curated by Professor Carlos Gasparri, and the works offer insights into the decorative tradition and aesthetic choices that are no longer visible in Villa Albani's current archaeological display, and included a spectacular group of marbles, including a beautiful, you were already seeing it, heirs on a chariot drawn by wild boars. To come to a conclusion, the recent series of exhibitions staged by the Foundation, made possible through the invaluable collaboration with leading international museums, represents for us the contemporary expression of a long-standing tradition of typically Roman artistic patronage. In this tradition, art shapes not only what we see, but also who we become. And it is why we feel that this exhibition in essence reflects the deep and vital connection between individual identity and cultural heritage. So we believe that classical culture, though rooted into antiquity, is defined by this remarkable capacity for reinvention, and it can serve in this modern time as a beacon of light, because this marble, this sculpture, are ideas impressed in marbles, and they remind us of ideas like dignity, beauty, and resilience, reminding us not only where we come from, but where we must hold on to. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Jennifer. First, I'd like to extend my thanks to Carlotta Lovarini-Botta. It's been such a pleasure to work with her to bring these extraordinary works to the Kimball, and it's an honor to be their temporary custodian. Also, my thanks to Eric and George and the board of the Kimball Art Foundation for their support. And of course, the amazing Kimball staff, everyone from registrars, prep and operations, conservation, marketing and PR, education, special events. A personal thank you to our curatorial assistant, Rebecca Goss. It takes a village, so it's not just me. But most important, I want to express my gratitude and admiration to the co-curators of the exhibition, Lisa Ayla Chakmak and Catherine Raff, who did an amazing job in making the final and thoughtful selection of 58 sculptures for the North American presentation of the tour, conceived the thematic organization of the works, and contributed to the catalog and wrote the excellent didactics, including the idea to provide the conservation diagrams on the labels for each sculpture, which you'll see in the exhibition. You both made my work here that much easier. So thank you to Lisa and Katie. And before I introduce Lisa first, just a note that after Catherine's lecture, there will be a brief period for Q&A. Dr. Lisa Ayla Chakmak is the Mary and Michael Jaharis Chair and Curator of the Arts of Greece, Rome, and Byzantium at the Art Institute of Chicago. Lisa completed her BA in Art History, Classical Archaeological track from Princeton University, earned her PhD from the Interdepartmental Program in Classical Art and Archaeology at the University of Michigan, and has an MBA from Washington University in St. Louis. Prior to her appointment at the Art Institute of Chicago, Lisa spent nearly a decade at the St. Louis Art Museum, most recently as the Andrew W. Mellon Associate Curator of Ancient Art, where she was responsible for the collections of ancient Near Eastern, Greek, Roman, and Egyptian art. During her tenure in St. Louis, she initiated and realized the highly successful 2018 exhibition, Sunken Cities, Egypt's Lost Worlds, as well as managing the reinstallations of the museum's galleries of Greek and Roman art and Egyptian and numismatic collections. Since coming to Chicago in 2020, Lisa has overseen a major installation of the Art Institute's Mary and Michael Jaharis galleries of Greek, Roman, and Byzantine art, as well as originating and serving as co-curator of Myth and Marble, ancient Roman sculpture from the Torlonia Collection, the first major exhibition on a topic of Greek or Roman art held at the Art Institute in over 44 years. In her lecture this morning, Lisa will share her insights into the monumental task of bringing these extraordinary works from the Torlonia Collection to North America for the first time. Please join me in welcoming Lisa Chakmak.
That's better. I'm a little bit of a shorty. So, I have to repeat all of the same thanks that Carlotta and Jennifer have offered, but especially to Eric, to Deputy Director George Shackelford, Jennifer Kastler-Price, the entire team here at the Kimball. IT, thank you, Gabe, Robert, who got me a Coke Zero this morning. God bless you. You guys really know how to throw a party. You really know how to host, and just congratulations to all of you on the opening of this beautiful exhibition. I'm incredibly honored and delighted to be here with you today to talk about the making of this monumental exhibition and what it was like to bring the Torlonia Collection to the United States. So like every project, it all starts with an idea. And sometimes that idea is the result of hours of reading and studying and thinking and then discussing and debating. And sometimes it's just like a strike of lightning. And in the case of Myth and Marble, it was this New York Times article on the left that was uploaded online on March 16th, 2016. And at the time, I was an associate curator at the St. Louis Art Museum. And the buzz that this article created in my tiny little world of ancient art curators in the United States, of which I think there are maybe 50 of us, we were all like calling each other and like, did you see this? Do you know Satis? I mean, we were all like incredibly intrigued. And then fast forward to October 2019, when the Times once again published about the upcoming exhibition that was set to open at the Capitoline in Rome in March 2020. But why did these two New York Times articles make such waves? As you've heard a little bit from Carlotta, the collection is historic, but I like to frame it for you this way. So imagine, think of your favorite artist or your favorite category of artwork. Okay, picture it in your mind. And then imagine that just one day, the body of work increases by some order of magnitude. Imagine if Da Vinci is your favorite, suddenly there are 622 more Da Vincis in the world. That is the impact of this collection coming back into the light. And that's why it made such waves. The New York Times covered it 2 whole times. How often does the New York Times cover antiquity? Not that often, I can tell you. So again, this collection, you're going to hear it from me. You're going to hear it from Katie. You're going to hear it. You're going to read about it in the exhibition. This is the largest privately held collection of ancient Roman sculpture in the world. It's 622 pieces of sculpture that cover a wide range of types and subjects. And really the best comparative collections are the collections of the Capitoline Museum in Rome, which is a municipal museum, and the Vatican Museums, which of course is the collection of the Papal State. So, as if this all wasn't special enough, as Carlotta said, Prince Alessandro Torlonia, established this museum in, an incredibly forward-thinking and visionary way. And thank you, Carlotta and the Foundation, for the same photo that we like to use in our presentations, a view of the museum in the 1930s. But almost equally as important to the establishment of the museum was the publication of the collection. So he hired noted archaeologist Carlo Ludovico Visconti, who was, a well-known antiquarian of the time, who produced in 1884 and 85 a 2-volume catalog. Volume 1 was the text, and Volume 2 were the illustrations. As Carlotta said, this used a new technology, the phototype, which is sort of a proto-photograph in which a metal printing block was used. Now, to put this in perspective and into context, this was a new technology. So essentially, this was a cutting-edge publication. Phototype was used from the late 18th century all the way into the 1970s and 80s. So it was a groundbreaking and revolutionary publication. But what, you may be wondering, does any of this have to do with the making of this exhibition? And that is, due to the age of the catalog, it is now out of copyright. and available to be downloaded from archive.org or Hathi Digital Trust. This proved to be an invaluable resource for Katie and me, especially as we were working on it sort of during the late stages of the pandemic, because it meant we were able to download both of the volumes and then have them printed and bound at our local Kinko's. And that allowed us to add sticky notes and write annotations and circle things. Mine has, some Sharpie stars next to some of my favorite sculptures. And so I just can't understate how essential this tool was for us. Without access to this catalog available digitally, it would have been much more difficult for us to winnow the over 600 sculptures down to the group of sculptures you see today. Now, it's not just about paging through the catalog and waiting for that inspiration to strike and writing stars next to our favorite things. We also always needed to think about how best to present this material for the first time to North American audiences. And with that in mind, we came to this question, which is, how did Romans use sculpture? And this is where my co-conspirator, Katie, comes into the equation. So I am what I like to describe, using a sports metaphor, and color commentary. And Katie is the brains of the operation. So Katie is the properly trained Romanist, and I just ask stupid and obvious questions. And so Katie, in thinking about Roman sculpture, was thinking about, all right, here are the primary categories of Roman sculpture that we want to make sure our audiences understand: portraiture, the commemoration of the dead, funerary sculpture, funerary monuments, and this weird category that we call sort of ideal sculptures, but this is often like gods and goddesses and athletes and soldiers. So we were thinking about how Romans used sculpture, what were sort of the essential categories of Roman sculpture. But then again, going back to thinking of our audience, we wanted to emphasize a couple of points of entry that we thought would be appealing to you guys. And that was, again, gods and goddesses. I have 2 kids who go to public school, and they do a lesson in Greek and Roman mythology in primary school. It's everywhere. A lot of people have some familiarity with Greek and Roman mythology, so we thought that would be a good entry point. We also really wanted to emphasize the uniqueness and the rarity of the Torlonia collection. And then the other thing, as scholars of ancient art, that we really want you to understand is how old these sculptures are. Okay, the oldest sculpture in the show dates to the 5th century BCE. That makes it about 2,500 years old. That's really old. Okay, and that's, from my perspective, really cool. Okay, so that's the other thing we wanted to emphasize, but also, we can't hold these things to their original standards. When something is 2,500 years old, it's gonna have some work done, okay? All right, so we just have to be okay with that. So how do we choose? We're thinking about all of these things. We're looking through the catalog. This is where arts and crafts come in. So we got our scissors and tape, and Katie and I would literally take screenshots of different things that we liked, and we'd print them out and we'd cut them out, and we created, this chaos. And then we moved to sort of this semi-chaos. These are the walls and door of my office back at Chicago. You can see we started to sort of slightly organize things. We have some portraits here. We have some gods and goddesses here. We have some funerary art. We have a family tree. This was really like that scene in A Beautiful Mind where it's like strings and arrows. This is what we were doing to ultimately get to this, an exhibition that is tailor-made for North American audiences. That includes 58 sculptures, 34 from earlier presentations, 24 newly selected and conserved. 11 new attributions were made during our work on this. And again, a question we got a lot: how did these sculptures get here? One transatlantic trip across the Atlantic Ocean. This is a big deal, guys. They had never flown on a plane before. They had never left the continent of Europe. And just in case everyone, we get this question a lot. If you're wondering, they did fly. they flew on cargo, so not first class, not economy, sort of just special. So now I want to walk you through how we created the order through the chaos. And there were some objects that we knew of from the collection that are just iconic. And here you're greeted in the exhibition by these three works of art. The Maiden of Volci, the portrait of a man known as Euthymides of Bactria, and the portrait of a man known as the Old Man of Otricoli. Now, these sculptures have nicknames, okay? You only get a nickname like this if you're famous. So how did these three sculptures in particular become so famous? This is where we have textbooks to thank. So here is the Old Man of Otricoli, and on the left is an illustration from Diana E. Kleiner's Roman sculpture textbook. This is a fundamental textbook in Roman sculpture. Katie and I both had to buy this in graduate school when we took Elaine Gazda's Hellenistic and Roman sculpture class together, I might add. That's how long Katie and I have known each other. But if you were not lucky enough to take Hellenistic and Roman sculpture when you were in school, you might have taken Art History 101 or an introduction to art through the ages. And that's the illustration from the ebook that you see on the other side of the screen, included in Gardner's Art Through the Ages, which is one of the standard Art 101 textbooks. And this was very fun for us because as we were walking many of our colleagues through the exhibition, there were curators from a lot of different departments who were like, wait, I know that sculpture. I don't know any of these other sculptures, but I know that old guy. It's he's hard to forget. I mean, look at those sunken cheeks. And I recommend when you have a moment, if you can try and look at him from the side, you can see he has quite the underbite because he's lost his top teeth, and he has very thinning hair. These are all details that our professor, Elaine Gazda, commented on when she saw the sculpture for the first time in her entire life, when we did a Scholars Day back in Chicago. So you can imagine I mean, we kind of cried a little bit. There's really a wonderful feeling to be able to give a moment like this to someone who has played such a formative role in your career and your education. So, it was incredibly, incredibly special. So be sure to take a special look at him. But the other two also, Euthymides of Bactria is illustrated in J.J. Pollitt's Art of the Hellenistic Age, and the Maiden of Volci is illustrated in Yves Dombra's Art and Identity in the Roman World. So, they get a lot of mileage from these textbooks. Now, in addition to being iconic, these three are also three of the earliest portraits in the Torlonia collection. And the collection has a particular strength in portraiture. Portraits comprise about 1/3 of its holdings. And if you remember, we're talking about over 622 to be exact, sculptures. So it's over 200 portraits. So how do you whittle down? How do you distill from 200 to maybe a dozen, 2 dozen? Do you focus on notable names and figures from Roman history? Do you select the best portraits in terms of artistic quality? I mean, that was a little dicey because remember, we were working on a downloaded PDF from archive.org. So that was maybe not going to be our direction. So in surveying the collection, we realized that the collection included portraits of nearly the entirety of the imperial family of the 2nd century. So that is all emperors from Trajan all the way to Septimius Severus and their wives. And this piqued our interest for a couple of reasons. First, the 2nd century is, let me just scroll down, a high point of the Roman Empire. It's the moment when the Roman Empire reaches its greatest geographic extent. And because of its expansion, there is a surge in construction and a surge in sculptural production. But there's also a second reason, and that has to do a little bit with name recognition. So besides the fact that, this is an important art historical and historical moment, we were thinking about, well, what might resonate with a non-specialist audience? What could be their point of entry for thinking about portraits of emperors and the imperial family? And that's how we got to Gladiator. excellent movie that is now 25 years old, it pains me to say. And I know what you're all thinking, right? Like, you're all thinking like, okay, ding dongs, really? You were using Gladiator to make curatorial decisions? And I am here to say, yes. Because like, let's take the help where we can, right? Like, let's not make our job any harder. If we can find a point of connection, let's use it. So it wasn't all smooth sailing from the Visconti images to reality. And this is one such example. We were so excited about MT 353. This is clearly a portrait of Faustina the Elder, who's the wife of the Emperor Antoninus Pius. And we have a comparative image from the Capitoline. So look at her hairstyle. She has these finger waves, a band that looks like two little rosettes, and then this sort of coiled bun. So we were like, I don't know why I keep using we. It's Katie. Katie was like, this is Faustina the Elder. I'm really excited about this portrait. And I was like, okay. But upon cleaning, it became clear that this sculpture wasn't actually fit for display because there was a break that went sort of right through the eyes. And the ancient portion, which was the upper portion, was quite discolored. And it was actually somewhat off-putting to have this sort of darkly discolored fragment sitting on the white marble restoration. So we needed to make some choices. And this is where, it's great to illustrate the collaborative process with the foundation. The foundation presented, suggested 3 alternative Antonine ladies. So we landed on the one on this side. MT 550, which is also identified by the Visconti in the Visconti catalog as Faustina the Elder. Now, here is the first choice, and here is the second choice, cleaned. We were at the point that this switch was made. We were kind of coming close to approaching our catalog deadline. And so we didn't really have time to go back and fully research this portrait in detail. So we ended up kind of hedging, and we changed the title to Portrait of a Woman Formerly Known as Faustina the Elder. Katie's going to tell you a lot about this in her lecture, because we just didn't want to put in the catalog that that we felt that this was certainly Faustina the Elder when we hadn't had time to do the research. That said, having lived with her in Chicago for 15 weeks, and of course by now Katie is very confident that this is indeed Faustina the Elder. So we move from our portraits of the imperial family of the 2nd century to gods and goddesses. This was a section that was really important to us. And before I kick off my sort of scripted notes, I do want to suggest for any of you in the audience who have kids or grandkids or just any kind of child around you in your life, I highly recommend that you bring them to the exhibition, because it is one of my true delights was walking through this exhibition with my son and his friend, and the way they were like, that's Athena, I can tell because of the helmet. That's Hercules, I can tell because of the lion skin. I bet that they can teach you a thing or two about the gods and goddesses on view in the exhibition. So one of the most important works in the Gods and Goddess section, but also in the entire Torlonia collection, is this work, the Hestia Justiniani. The statue's appellation, Hestia Justiniani, dates to the years before it entered the Torlonia collection, as Carlotta mentioned, when it was held in the collection of Vincenzo Giustiniani, who was an Italian banker who assembled a massive art collection in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Now, this sculpture is also a little bit like one of these things is not like the other. One of these things just doesn't belong when it comes to the figure's garment and the style in which it is carved. So the drapery is rendered very vertically. Thank you. Vertically. She's very frontal. She doesn't have a lot of twisting. And she's also wearing a very, very outdated garment. By the time this sculpture was carved in the 2nd century, this garment was maybe 500, 600 years out of fashion. So it's a little bit like if we look at an Elizabethan Tudor portrait, that's the type of separation we're talking about in terms of stylistic changes. Now, Sculptors in the later Hellenistic and Roman periods often looked back on earlier Greek precedents, and that's exactly what they're doing here. So what this is a Roman version of an ancient 5th century Greek style statue that is carved in what is called the severe style. But why Hestia? Does anyone know who Hestia is? Goddess of the hearth, right? Like, she doesn't get out much because she's too busy tending the hearth. So, Katie and I asked our research associate who worked on this, could you do some research into why this is called Hestia? And we think it's because of the veil and the conservative dress in the early modern period in Rome was associated with the Vestal virgins. And Vesta is the Roman version of Hestia. The Vestal virgins, of course, tend to the hearth of the city of Rome. So we think that idea of Vesta turned to Hestia. In reality, I would probably venture to say that this was meant to represent either Hera or Demeter, who really are much more popular sculptural and artistic subjects. The other really important thing about the Hestia is illustrated in this conservation diagram, where you see how little blue there is. The blue is the modern restoration. So this is the most intact Roman copy of an earlier Greek severe style sculpture that is known in the world. If you want to see examples of severe style Greek sculpture, you have to go to Greece, and really specifically, you have to go to Olympia. There's just not that much of it out there. And what you do see at Olympia is incredibly fragmentary. So this, the state of this is just exceptional. So in contrast to Hestia, we wanted to include, some of the more recognizable names. So Athena is very popular. Here you can see she has much more modern restoration, notably to her head, her arms. The spear is also a modern addition. And remember, I was talking about how old these sculptures are. I mean, she's a little bit younger. She's only about 2,000 years old, but she's on her 3rd facelift. We know that she had her ancient head, then she had a second head that is described in the inventories of the Justiniani catalog inventory, which doesn't quite match this head. So it seems that she got her 3rd head, when she entered the Torlonia Collection. And a note about the name, you might be wondering, we sometimes use the Greek names, we sometimes use the Roman names. And here we use Athena because the source image for this sculpture is the cult statue of Athena from the Parthenon in Athens, so the Athena Parthenos. So because there is a very clear source object for this statue, we keep the Greek name rather than calling her Minerva. And so I highlight this point for you because as you're walking through the exhibition, not just this exhibition, but literally any exhibition, everything is a decision. Almost nothing is left to chance. Nothing is really accidental. I also want to call out the detail on her chest. Hitting the wrong buttons. Here, she has the head of Medusa on her chest. This was a gift because everybody likes to receive a head of a monster with snakes for hair as a present. A gift given to her that she wears on her chest. And we have these two, we included these two ornamental composite sculptures that have the head of Medusa placed upon an ancient table leg. And here, I'd really like to take a moment to acknowledge Deputy Director George Shackelford. It was George who noticed that in our initial checklist, there were no ornamental or architectural sculptures. And this was partly due to scale. You saw in Carlotta's slides, that giant basin is huge. And the amount of space that we had in Chicago really wasn't, we weren't going to be able to accommodate it. But I also have to confess, we kind of just forgot about this category of sculpture. And George very gently was like, I would love to see something from that category. So we went back to Visconti and found these. We found that they were more spatially modest and thematically consistent with our other collections. And then finally, to round out talking about gods and goddesses, this is just a handful of the gods and goddesses, is this Cupid and Psyche. This is one of those pieces where there was not a ton of thought that went into it. We saw it in Visconti. We loved it. We saw it in the labs before it was cleaned. We loved it. We saw it in the labs after it was cleaned. We still loved it. We loved it so much, we put it on the cover of the catalog. It's just a really beautiful sculpture. It is a motif that you find in the ancient Greek world as Eros and Psyche, and then you see it in the later Roman world, and it continues all the way through European art. But this sculpture, funnily enough, gave me a little bit of a problem. I drew the short straw and had to write the label for this one. And if you know your Ovid is a Latin, a Roman author and poet. He wrote the Metamorphoses, which is a really good resource for ancient mythology. And he spins this long story. It's like 20 pages in the Penguin Classic translation of Ovid about Cupid and Psyche. And here I am trying to make, to distill this 20-page story into an 80-word label. And it wasn't working. It wasn't compelling. And I went to my colleagues and I was like, I don't know what to talk about. And I was so annoyed. Honestly, that's what I was just annoyed. And I was like, stupid Ovid, like, how can I outdo Ovid? Ovid is Ovid. And then I did have a good idea. Ovid, as I mentioned, is a Latin author. Cupid is the Latin name for the son of Venus, who in Greece is called Eros. Psyche is an ancient Greek word. It's the word that means breath or soul. So Ovid did something very interesting here. He did not translate psyche, the Greek word, into Latin, which would have been something like anima. So this motif does not come down to us as Cupid and anima. It comes down to us as Cupid and Psyche. So ultimately what we're looking at here is the marriage between the Greek world and the Roman world. And this is very important for our work, which is essentially that both of them need one another. You don't have Rome without everything that comes from Greece. I would argue you have Greece without Rome, but we can talk about that later. But I'm sharing this anecdote with you so that you can understand that there are a lot of these sort of like thinking points that we have to make. It's not just thinking about the objects. And so just like writing a paper for class in a pre-chat GPT, pre-generative AI era, you have to work out your outline. You have to figure out your thesis statement. What points do you want to make? Like I said, it's not all just left up to chance. We chart it out and we partner with our colleagues in museum interpretation, and they came to our office with their, pieces of poster, sticky poster, and their pile of Post-it notes and Sharpies to come up with a big idea. Basically, this is our primary thesis statement. And they have a system. They're like, okay, you need a subject, you need a verb, and you need a consequence. And you just start throwing Post-it notes on each piece of paper. And then you start putting them together. It's a little bit sort of like Mad Libs. You like fill one in, you take another one until you kind of find a sentence that works. And so ultimately the sentence we landed on is that ancient Romans lived in a visual culture that resonates with our own. So that is the overarching big idea for the exhibition. We also wanted to emphasize the private nature of the Torlonia Collection, and of course, that the original function and meaning of these ancient objects didn't remain fixed. When something is so old, it's going to live a lot of life. It's going to live in different contexts, in different time periods, in different places, and interact with different kinds of people. So far what I've recounted in terms of making this show has been very much like desk work. We've been sitting, we've been cutting out pieces of paper, we've been downloading things from the internet, we've been thinking. We also get to go places. This really is a fundamental part of making any exhibition. So of course, we went to Rome to see the inaugural exhibition at the Capitoline, of course, curated beautifully by Salvatore Secchis and Carlo Gaspari and designed by Sir David Chipperfield. Here's another shot of that basin that was just too big for us to host in Chicago. We got to go to Galleria d'Italia, and see the exhibition in Milan. And of course, we went to the Louvre. Now, it's not just about visiting these other exhibitions. I should note that every time we went to Europe, we also went to the labs and visited with Carlotta and Carlotta's team to see, the work that they were doing on our selections. But we also wanted to immerse ourselves in the history of the collection. And one thing that, for me as a reformed archaeologist, was really important is one of the primary ways that the Torlonias expanded their collection was through archaeological excavation. So the family were one of the largest landholders in and around Rome in the 19th century. And this is a really important part of the family's history and the history of the collection, but it's very hard to understand space from a Google map, especially a Google map in Italian, where you're like, is Maxencio? Is that Matthew? Is that Maxentius? So we were like, you know what? We're going to take this show on the road. We are going to go and look at all of these places to get a sense of what these ancient sites were like. So this is a shot of the Villa of the Quintilii. This was a huge sort of residential complex or compound built outside the city walls of Rome by the Quintilii brothers, who were, elite senatorial an elite senatorial family. And in fact, the complex elicited somewhat of an adverse response from the Emperor Caracalla, who confiscated the villa from the estate from the brothers in 182-3 because he wanted it for himself. So we went here. We went to the Circus of Maxentius, which is also, both of these two places are situated along the Via Appia Antica. The Circus of Maxentius is part of a complex of buildings that was erected by, can you guess? Maxentius in the early 4th century CE. This is the second largest circus in the region of Rome. Obviously, I think most people know the Circus Maximus, but this one is actually better preserved. And so this is yet another place that was part of the Torlonia real estate portfolio. We also wanted to go to Portus, the ancient harbor of Rome, where the Portus relief was excavated in 1864. This was also very sort of illuminating and informative for us because in contrast to the first two sites that were elite residential complexes, you can think about, all right, if you were to excavate, who's a Texas billionaire? Someone throw out a name. Bass. So if you were to excavate the Bass family compound, imagine the type of objects that you would find, right? You're not going to find the same things in my house, right? Like different economic strata. But Portus is a hub. It's a harbor. It's a working town. But they also held property here. So the types of objects that were excavated here are quite different in character. And it was important to us for people to really understand what a huge role Portus played in the success of the expansion of the Roman Empire. All goods coming to Rome had to come through Portus because Rome, if you've been there, if you remember, it's an inland city. So you have to, this is the Mediterranean. This is the sort of the ancient coastline, because this is the Trajanic harbor that, if you look at it on Google Maps, is a hexagon. It's very cool. And then this is the Tiber River, and then Rome is sort of down river. And of course, this is where our Portus relief comes from. And I want to take a moment to, this is an amazing object, and you should spend quite a bit of time looking at it. It's probably one of the most beloved works in the exhibition. Like I said, it was excavated. We know exactly when it was excavated, in 1864, but it's an incredibly rare piece of sculpture in that it depicts the place where it was excavated. And that is relatively rare. And the reason we know it depicts Portus is because of the presence of the lighthouse. So the lighthouse is sort of a shorthand for Portus in antiquity, in the way that you might think of the Eiffel Tower as a symbol of Paris. So we're going to places, we're really immersing ourselves in the history of the collection. So we take all of that information that we're gathering, and we apply it to exhibition design. Now, this is something that's really special. So Myth and Marble at the Art Institute of Chicago marked the first time that any kind of ancient Greek or Roman artwork had ever been so prominently featured in the modern wing, which was designed by Renzo Piano. And this decision to place our exhibition in our Renzo Piano building was really important because it underscored our curatorial vision of bringing the past to the present rather than trying to recreate the past. And so how fortunate that the Kimball also has a Renzo Piano building and also installed the exhibition in the Renzo Piano building. And because we really wanted to be mindful of the vocabulary, the architectural vocabulary of these buildings in thinking about exhibition design. We didn't want to recreate ancient Roman spaces. We didn't want to, make it too on the nose with certain colors. But there are certain direct correlations between design decisions in ancient Roman art and architecture. So one of them, this is Katie and I doing work. I think literally my husband was like, point at something. And so we're at the Palazzo Massimo alla Terme looking at the frescoes from the Villa of Livia at Prima Porta. And we ended up sending this photo to the designer of the exhibition catalog. And we said, ignore the yellow and the red at the bottom. Use this as your color inspiration for the catalog. And so then they came up with this Pantone palette of purples and greens and grays. Because we really wanted, in terms of color, we didn't want to do anything, again, that one might expect. So literally the design brief for both the book designers and the exhibition designer in Chicago said, no brick red, no mustard yellow. But we still wanted we wanted the color scheme to be grounded in ancient art. So we were really excited when the book designers came up with this. And so, of course, I must shill for the book. This is the first English language catalog of the collection. It is intended for non-specialist audiences. It includes all new photography of all 58 objects and includes very extensive conservation notes on all of the objects at the end of the book. I also want to make a challenge. I'll have you know that in Chicago, we sold out the catalog the last weekend of the show. So Texas, let's see what you can do. All right. Someone's going to have to send me a little update. But we were also, there are also some design elements that we can take no credit for. These are inspiration slides that were sent to us by our amazing colleague in Chicago, Richard Ferrer, who is the exhibition designer. We met with him and he went off and did his own research, and he came back with these images because we were really scared of including so many portraits. Because I think sometimes rows and banks of portraits can be a little bit hard to look at. And so Richard found these source images and was thinking about how we could take the portraits and sort of compose family groups that were very sort of deliberate and strategically composed. And that's how we got sort of from this to this. So there are 19 portraits arrayed very intentionally in these familial groups at sort of different heights. And I would also call out here, you see 2 cylindrical pedestals and several square pedestals. The cylindrical pedestals indicate an emperor, a portrait of an emperor during his regnal years. So a little bit of shorthand there. Richard was also, as a trained architect, he was also really inspired by the architecture of the ancient city. He was interested in the Circus Maximus and the Circus of Maxentius, but he was also thinking about Roman imperial fora. And so we were able to do this in Chicago. He actually created, this shape of Roman circus. This was really, I understand why it wasn't recreated here at the Kimball because this gallery is sort of long and narrow. So this design really worked for us, and it meant that you could circumambulate and see these 7 sculptures in the round. And this was just a design detail that we loved. But you can also see vestiges of the design that Jennifer and her team came up here. When you walk into the gallery, it really does have the feel of an imperial forum space that would have had colonnades and statues along the sides, as well as monuments peppered all over the place. And so to wrap things up, I just wanted to tell you a couple of stories of things we learned along the way. So in the 15-week run in Chicago, Katie and I gave something like 80 tours. And there were some questions that we got that we were like, wow, we didn't think about that. And this was one of them. So here are the first three emperors of the 2nd century, Trajan, Hadrian, and Antoninus Pius, whom we affectionately refer to as Tony P. And you can see the circles on their chests showing the image that's on their breastplate. And similar to Athena, this is the head of Medusa. But one of these looks a little bit different, and that's the one in the middle. But let's zoom in here. So you can see the two on the outside and then the one on the inside. You know, she has her tongue sticking out, her hair is different. And so I just wanted to show you, because people were asking us, oh, what is that symbol? What is that image on the breastplates of the emperors? And it's Medusa. And what's interesting about Medusa is that she has kind of, she gets sort of a makeover, a glow up, like she hires a good PR firm. I don't know, but she in the Greek world, Medusa is a monster. She is a monstrous deity she's the daughter of two sea monsters. And she's scary. Like, she sticks her tongue, she's got fangs, she wears like a necklace of boar's teeth, she's got the snaky hair, and she's scary and monstrous. So it makes sense to have that kind of symbol on the front of your armor to scare your enemy away. Our friend Ovid, who I was talking about earlier, gives her a new story and a new background. What Ovid says is that Medusa is a beautiful maiden who's raped by the god Neptune. And because the Romans were, I guess, all about blaming the victim, she gets transformed into, her hair gets transformed into snakes. So you have this sort of beautiful face with this, I mean, I feel like my hair looks like that and it's not made of snakes, but I'm like, oh, that's pretty nice snaky hair if I've ever seen snaky hair. But you get these kind of two different trajectories of Medusa. And the inspiration photo here might look familiar to those composite ornamental sculptures I showed earlier, because those are based on the Medusa Rondinini that's in the Glyptothek in Munich. And so the best way Katie and I found to illustrate this was this. So you've got your Lego minifig with this sort of like scary Medusa. And then you have Uma Thurman, who literally can't look ugly even if she has snakes on her head. So you've got these two versions of Medusa on the Imperial breastplates. And then finally, at the end of the exhibition, Jennifer has placed the funerary section. And I want you to look very carefully at two objects. Well, obviously, look carefully at all the objects, but if you're pressed for time, look carefully at this sarcophagus and this sarcophagus. So this sarcophagus was produced in Asia Minor. We know this because of the style with the columns separating each scene. This is the hallmark of Asia Minor sarcophagus workshop production. You just kind of have to believe me on that. Versus the frieze style one at the bottom, which was produced in Italy. Now, what's interesting here, and this kind of goes all the way back to like the thinking that Katie and I did in terms of how Romans used a visual language. So these were produced in two completely different geographic locations in the Roman Empire, one in modern day Turkey, one probably in Italy. But look at how the labors of Heracles are illustrated. It's the same general format for each labor. So the lion, this is the Nemean lion. The lion is always on the left. Hercules is on the right in both. Then you move on to the Lernaean Hydra. Now, they're not identical. If you look at the Lernaean Hydra up here, she has sort of a human head, and down here, it's all snakes. But he's also facing left. The Lernaean Hydra is between Heracles or Hercules and the lion, and so on and so forth, all the way down to those first five labors. So what Katie and I failed to point out in the label, because we didn't think about this point until about halfway through the run of the exhibition, is that despite completely different geographic like places of production, there was a playbook here. If you illustrated the labors of Hercules, this is how you did it. The first 5 were always in this order, and the general composition was always the same in terms of which way he's facing, where the creature is. And you can even notice, so he had 12 labors. It took him a long time. It took him 10 years. So by labor 4, he grows a full beard. And you see that also 1, 2, 3, 4 here. And so, it's with this final object or set of pair of objects, I encourage you to look through and walk through the exhibition and look for those signs, look for those signals of how the Romans are trying to portray a sense of Roman identity or non-Roman identity. Also look for non-Roman identity. There's a quick shorthand here. If you see a beard, that might not be a Roman, but then things get all confusing with Hadrian. So it's like, there are all of these really interesting visual details. And so I thank you all for coming out here on a Saturday morning and listening to me drone on for, however long I've droned on, probably too long. And Jennifer is going to come up and introduce my my beloved Katie, and then we will take questions at the very, very end. But thank you.
Now I'm going to be really tall. Seriously. Thank you, Lisa, for really laying out the exhibition for us. I hope that we're all thinking about the Roman Empire now. Actually, I'm going to step down because this seems kind of weird. So it's my pleasure now to introduce the brains of the operation. Dr. Catherine A. Raff is the Elizabeth McIlvaine Curator in the Arts of Greece, Rome, and Byzantium at the Art Institute of Chicago, where she has worked since 2011. Catherine holds a PhD, MA, and Museum Studies certificate from the University of Michigan, as well as a BA from the University of Wisconsin. Her research interests center on the arts and visual culture of the broader ancient Roman world, with a particular emphasis on sculpture, including portraits, ideal sculptures, and funerary monuments, as well as the modern afterlives of ancient objects. Prior to joining the Art Institute, she was awarded fellowships from the United States Fulbright Program and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and held internships at the Terra Museum of American Art and the Art Institute of Chicago. Catherine's recent projects include co-curating the exhibition Myth and Marble, the reinstallation of the Art Institute's permanent gallery of Roman art, and Collecting Stories, an installation exploring the reception of ancient artworks in early modern European collections. She was the editor and primary author of the 2017 digital scholarly catalog, Roman Art at the Art Institute of Chicago, which remains the most extensive publication to date of an area of the museum's ancient Mediterranean collection. And I encourage you all to go look it up online. I used it extensively when I was doing my research and preparation for the exhibition. Her lecture today will focus on the Imperial portraits in the Torlonia Collection, with an emphasis on portraits of Imperial women. Please join me in welcoming Katie Raff.
Okay, I need to move the box, so just give me a second while I disappear. Okay. Well, once again, I have, excuse me, I've been sitting here so long now, I'm froggy. Hold on a second. It is so wonderful to be here today. I have the same, slew of thank yous to extend. So once again, I would just like to thank everyone here at the Kimball. You've been so generous and kind and welcoming, and I can't thank you enough for everything you've done for all of us, for Lisa and me during our visit. Special thanks, of course, to Eric Lee, Deputy Director George Shackelford, and of course, the amazing Jennifer Kassler-Price. And once again, we would like to really like to extend my deepest thanks to the Torlonia Foundation and the Torlonia family for their ongoing collaboration and incredible support. Specifically, President Alessandro Pomomorialdo and, of course, Director Carlota Loverini Botta. Without you, this would just not have been possible. And of course, my ride or die, Lisa Chakmak. I couldn't have imagined doing this project with anyone but you. So at any rate, I am so honored to be here today to talk about this project. As you can imagine, this has really been a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us. And so I'm just so thrilled to talk to you today about portraits, which are basically one of my favorite things in the entire world. So I think you'll be able to tell. So as you've already heard, Imperial portraits are one of the strengths of the Torlonia Collection, comprising about a third of its holdings. And so here you see the portrait gallery as we had it installed in Chicago. And of course, in the 19th century, when the Museo Torlonia was founded and the collection was being published, many of these works were being identified largely as portraits of different emperors and imperial family members. And so I'm just going to show you here. Of course, if you haven't seen the exhibition here at the Kimball, this is just so beautifully installed, especially the portraits, but everything is just gorgeous. And so I really want to speak to you today again about some of these insights into these portraits that we gained through the research that we carried out in preparation for this exhibition over the course of 5 years now. And so one of the things I really want to point out, which I know that Carlota has already discussed, the sort of heavy involvement of conservation in all of this, is that so much of the work that went into this project was incredibly collaborative between us and the Torlonia Foundation. And of course, not just for this particular corpus of the portraits, this is for everything. And we were very fortunate to be able to work closely and to sort of learn and collaborate with the conservators and also a number of scholars affiliated with the foundation to make many of the new discoveries I'll be sharing with you a bit more about today. So I really can't stress enough, again, how art historically important this collection is. And of course, as you see here, here's a different archival photo. Portraits were really a key component of the Museo Torlonia from its origins in 1876. And while they appeared in different rooms of the museum, the true portrait gallery came as sort of the grand conclusion to the museum in its final room, room 77. And, you know, there's something I just find so, I don't know, poignant about these images of this idea that these objects, like you see these people in period clothing, and here we are today, and these objects have just lived these incredibly long, rich lives and will, you know, presumably outlive us as well. And so, you know, this impressive breadth and depth of the collection was celebrated in the museum's early years by its first two curators. So the first curator, Pietro Ercole Visconti, in sort of about to sort of discuss the portraits, he goes on to say how this is a group that still has no equal in any other museum, not accepting the Vatican and Capitoline museums, and may never have its equal in the future. I just want to say, I mean, he's right. Okay, this is the most important private collection of Roman sculpture in the world and remains so today. And then, not to be outdone, his nephew and successor, Carlo Ludovico Visconti, who of course published the amazing volume that you've heard about multiple times now with the plates. I want to say also, I normally hate text-heavy slides, but this was just, you had to see it all. So he goes on to say, there are also objects that must be considered unique and rare, which alone would make the reputation of any museum, as well as a series of busts and portraits, particularly of Roman imperial iconography, that surpasses in both quantity and quality the celebrated collections of the Vatican and Capitoline museums. Now, as you've already heard from Lisa, I mean, those are like just full stop, the best, most preeminent collections of Roman sculpture in the world. And with that, of course, have, you know, the highest quality, among the highest quality collections of Roman portraits. Again, the Vatican being the papal collection, the Capitoline being the municipal collection of Rome. So I'm just saying this to really stress that when we're looking at the portraits, really everything, but of course I'm talking about the portraits today, the Torlonia collection is right up with them in terms of depth and breadth and quality. It's on par. Now, again, as part of our collaborative work on this project, as Lisa mentioned, we were very fortunate that the foundation allowed us to select from the entire collection when forming our checklist. And really, it was such a kid in a candy store moment that we got to pick again from works that hadn't been conserved. And this really gave us such an amazing opportunity to think about, again, as you've already heard, the stories we wanted to tell. And we knew that portraiture would be a key component of this exhibition, not only because it's such an important part of the collection, but just because there's so many stories we could tell with these objects. And it was just an incredibly rare opportunity to select works that hadn't been displayed in more than 70 years. And beyond that, we really saw this as a really wonderful opportunity to add to the growing scholarly discourse on the Torlonia Collection, with the hope of making further contributions to the broader study of Roman imperial portraiture. So again, where do we begin? We go back to our friend Visconti. And again, as you've seen in Lisa's slides, just paging through, going through all the portraits, flagging them, and thinking about, is it the most important historical figures? Is it what looks most sort of the highest quality? It's so hard to tell from these images. But the images were still very critical to this. And I do want to point out for those of you, again, if you have not been to the exhibition yet, you can see some of these plates sort of blown up in exhibition copies today to really get a sense of how remarkable and in some instances very useful for us these images were. We did have a few other sources we were able to consult. So we were able to look to the 2020 exhibition catalog published by that exhibition's curators, Professor Salvatore Settis and Professor Carlo Gaspari. So that gave us some information on some of a select number of portraits that were in the European presentation, mostly some of the emperors. And we also looked to a 2022 book by another esteemed Italian colleague, Stefania Tuccinardi, which was incredibly helpful for thinking about the object's individual histories. But really, as far as our checklist went, the Visconti catalog was just sort of the primary source of information. And so now you've already heard a little bit about, well, we decided at this point to focus on the 2nd century. And there's a few reasons. Of course, the first, as you've heard, is that there appeared to be portraits of all of the 2nd century emperors and many members of their families. And you see some of these individuals here. So this includes wives and what also appeared to be, some family members such as sisters and children. But of course, from a historical and an art historical standpoint, the 2nd century is just an incredibly important period in the Roman world. This is when the empire reaches its greatest geographic extent under the Emperor Trajan in 117. That's the year when he dies. So he's sort of a military emperor who's kind of pushing the boundaries of the sort of known Roman world. And you can see here, it touches 3 continents. This is a massive geographic expanse under Roman control. And of course, not everyone living in this massive world speaks the dominant languages of the elite, right? Most people aren't speaking Latin in the West and Greek in the East. But this is where, of course, the images, and as Lisa mentioned, as we thought about our sort of big idea, this idea that sculptures were used as a visual language to communicate across this massive empire and to communicate all sorts of ideas of power and authority and identity. And so this expansion, of course, came with, the kind of construction of these massive buildings that filled the Roman public landscape, libraries and baths and arenas. And they were adorned with sculptures of deities and heroes, but also images of emperors and their family members. And just to really give you a sense of scale, I mean, these are big objects. This isn't like tabletop decorative sculptures, which are you find in different contexts. But we just have this massive surge in sculptural production. So the 2nd century is such a critical period to look at. And then finally, of course, it is the age of the quote unquote adoptive emperors. And this is a point where the empire is really being held together by a series of strategic adoptions and marriages. And this is because there were a lot of childless marriages among imperial family members, but also, unfortunately, there were high child mortality rates at this period. And we just don't get sort of male heirs to take over. Now, what we get is the sort of narrative tends to be that the reigning emperor will choose his successor based on sort of, like someone else in his orbit, the sort of right man for the job. And this is, I'm going to tell you more about why we've sort of kind of tried to think that through a little bit more. But these adoptions that are happening to sort of name a successor and adopt him, these are political and administrative acts. This is not an act of love or family of like, oh, I'm going to adopt this sweet little baby and like make him the emperor. Like this is like adoption at 40. And so, you might be thinking, okay, well, that's great. Like they're adopting their successors. That's all well and good. But how does this relate to the portraits? Like, why should I care what this looks like in the portraits? And this was something that was really so critical to our storytelling, was linking the sort of this idea of dynastic succession to what we're seeing in the development of portraiture. And that, again, remember that Romans, for so many Romans at the time, first of all, they would probably never see the actual emperor anytime in their life, but also that they're learning about the world around them and who's in charge and who has authority through visual means. And so this needs to be communicated clearly, these connections between people, through the way their portraits look. So the 2nd century is this period is where we start to see hairstyles and beards really being used to suggest fictive familial connections between where adoptions are occurring. So our friend Trajan, as we like to talk about, the goofy guy on the left, he is the last Roman emperor at this point to not wear a beard. So you're looking at him and you can see he's clean shaven, and his successor Hadrian on the right is not. Hadrian is bearded. Now, that might not seem all that remarkable to us today. You can look around the room, I'm sure, and see people with different hairstyles, different kinds of facial hair. But the fact is that Trajan was shown clean shaven, as were his predecessors, because Roman male citizens needed to be shown clean shaven. Wearing a beard is sort of a mark of foreignness. And so you might wonder, well, why does Hadrian wear a beard then if he's a Roman emperor? The short answer is we don't know for sure. Now, the ancient literary sources tell us maybe he wanted to cover acne. Maybe he had scars. Maybe we like to joke, like, maybe he just thought it looked cool. Like, maybe he's like, oh, with my bone structure, I can really pull off a beard. We don't know. But the idea is that the prevailing interpretation is that it had to do with Hadrian's love of Greek culture. He was emperor for 21 years, and he spent a considerable amount of his reign visiting Greece. And so what's interesting is that Greek men at this time, again, so, not Roman men, Greek men still wore beards. So, but what's interesting, if you look at Hadrian, it's not a sort of scraggly, like long philosopher's beard. It's a very trim, cultivated beard. And, one could say, well, maybe his successor doesn't want to wear a beard. But the thing is doesn't matter. Whatever Antoninus Pius felt, he had to adopt this look, because then he is adopted by Hadrian as his immediate successor. And so, again, we like to joke, like, maybe Antoninus Pius was secretly like, man, like, this is itchy. I don't want to wear this, but like, I have to, because I have to look like I relate to Hadrian. So what's interesting, though, if you look at these two men here, they look alike enough. Like, they could be related, again, through the curly hair and the beards, but they aren't clearly the same person. They can still be distinguished. And this is what's really important, is that the emperor needs to always be instantly recognizable among other individuals. Now, this beard and hairstyle trend just kind of like let it ride. It just keeps on going through the 2nd century. And so Antoninus Pius adopts 2 successors, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. And so both of these 2 men, again, are not like immediately related by blood to Antoninus Pius, but they have to continue this look of the sort of, we look like we could belong to the same family, which is where, again, we get this sort of beard. Now, what's interesting is Marcus Aurelius is also known as the sort of philosopher emperor. That might be a little bit of why we see his going a little bit longer. But, this is the idea of this, is that they need to look like they're related to legitimize their authority. They're not actually related by blood. They're not family members. And the portraits need to suggest that there is this fictive familial relationship. Now, one of the questions we got a lot of during the exhibition, and not just in Chicago, and not just in relation to these guys, but just in general with the portraits, was, well, is this what any of these people really looked like? And the short answer is, we don't know for sure. These images are probably grounded on some level in actual physical appearances, of course, but in the same way that, someone today might Photoshop an image, or, I don't know, I want to look a little thinner, or I want my face to look this way, or whatever, maybe that's what the actual court portrait artists were doing. We don't know for sure, but there seems to be some attempt, presumably, at like actual physical likeness. Now, these adoption relationships are complicated. And we found ourselves, as we would talk through the exhibition and the sort of goals with people, that we kept coming back to showing a family tree in Lisa's office. And so we realized that it would just make so much sense to have one in the exhibition. So the one here at the Kimball, the colors are a little different, but it's the same idea. And where here we have these dotted lines, they might be, I'm sorry if they're a little difficult to see here today, but showing where these adoptions are happening. And I want to point out, too, the faces you see here, those are the actual portraits in the exhibition to help you sort of connect who's who. But now there are, of course, many other names on the family tree who don't have images, and we'll get to that in just a moment. These are primarily the wives and sisters and daughters of these emperors. Now, just a note about nomenclature for a minute here. These women were not empresses. And what I mean by that is that the word emperor comes from the Latin term imperator, which means commander of the military. Women did not hold official political or military office in the Roman world. So technically saying empress is actually incorrect because they didn't necessarily hold official power in that way. Roman women could, or imperial women could hold sort of honorific titles, but they didn't give them that sort of level of power or authority. However, Roman women, imperial women, could have a certain amount of soft power and influence, and this is really by virtue of their access to and close ties with the emperor. So, for example, they could show support or opposition to adoptions or marriages that involve members of their families and things like that. And that was really the side of the story that we wanted to also highlight in this exhibition, that it's not just about the emperor picking sort of the next right candidate, but it's that what was the role of the women in this? Because you know, in the Roman world, women ran the household. Domus, the word for house, also means household, and that's everyone inside of it. And that was really sort of the domain of women. And these imperial women played a big role in the imperial house, and we really wanted to highlight that in this show. Now, one case study here, just looking at sort of one family group, which we'll look at the portraits in a little bit, is Emperor Trajan again. Now, he was really interesting in that he elevated the women in his life through imperial imagery. So this is his wife Plotina, his sister Marciana, just to the left, and then her daughter Matidia. And so you can see here, of course, again, Trajan has no son of his own. He and Plotina have no children. And he adopts Hadrian. But now it's not that simple that Trajan just went, yep, I'll take Hadrian. The women are thought to have played an important role in succession here, specifically Plotina. So Hadrian was actually a ward of Trajan's family as a child. So he had actually lived in the imperial household for some time. And Plotina is said by literary sources to have had sort of a soft spot for him. And on Trajan's deathbed in 117, he needed an heir. He needed to officially, name his heir. And the ancient literary sources like to tell the tale that Plotina sort of took Trajan's hand. I love when we would walk through the show, Lisa would always sort of grab my hand and demonstrate this. But that Plotina took Trajan's hand and sort of helped sign the adoption paperwork to make Hadrian the next successor. So there was a little bit of outcry at the time about this. It's interesting because often the literary sources, when they do tell us about imperial women, they tend to describe them as conniving, scheming, cheating on their husbands. They're just nothing but bad things, which is probably not all the truth, as this is the story we're trying to make clear. But the thing is that was not a snap decision on Trajan's deathbed. Of course, Hadrian was a ward of the family. And who is he married to? Follow the family tree up. He is married to Sabina, who is the grandniece of Trajan. She is the link. She is like the unifying link. She is directly bloodline related to Trajan. Whoever marries Sabina gets to be emperor. And they married 17 years before he became emperor. So this is just saying that Plotina also really is said to have sort of arranged that match. Trajan wasn't apparently too sold on it. But still, Plotina got her way. And this is sort of Hadrian becomes the next emperor. Now, as an aside, Sabina and Hadrian hated each other. There's a whole lot of drama in the imperial family with these two. He allegedly tried to kill her. All sorts of fun things happening, which there's a little bit about that in the exhibition. But at any rate, not all arranged marriages work out so well. At any rate, but thinking more about dynastic succession and bringing this back to the portraits, there's one Roman matron extraordinaire featured in this exhibition, and this is Faustina the Younger. And she's someone who really exemplifies how imperial women played such a critical role in the continuation of the imperial family. Now, this portrait was originally identified as Lucilla, which was her second oldest daughter. And through having spent my entire adult life looking at sculptures, I really felt strongly that this was, in fact, Faustina the Younger, so the mother, for a variety of reasons. But, this woman occupies an incredibly rare position in Roman portraiture because there are at least 10 known portrait types that depict her. Most emperors have 2, 4, but she had such a central role in the imperial family. She's kind of depicted through most of her life. So types meaning there's sort of a set, example with the face looks a certain way, the hair looks a certain way. And so we see some of that as she gets older. And this is, of course, not just because she was married to an emperor. she had 4 direct points of connection to 4 different emperors. So specifically, she was the daughter of our friend Tony P here, entered the imperial house at the age of 8, and had the fortune to be the only child to live to adulthood in of her parents' 4 children, which really sort of put a burden on her shoulders to be the mortar holding the next line of the imperial family together. She goes on to marry Marcus Aurelius, her father's preferred successor. He's sort of like the chosen one relative to the two of them. Now, bless her heart, Faustina the Younger had upwards of, like, hold your seat here for a minute, 14 children. So think about medicine in the 2nd century. And, just anyway, I still can't wrap my mind around that. Now, again, child mortality rates were high. Only 6 of them lived to adulthood, and only 1 of them was male. And as you heard about earlier from Lisa, if you saw Gladiator 25 years ago, things don't go so well with this one. So he is the emperor. He's the first one. He's like the Nepo baby extraordinaire. He is the first emperor born in the purple, which is a modern phrase used to sort of talk about, the first, like, he's born and he will be the emperor. He's born to a reigning emperor. Now, what's interesting, again, bringing this back to the portraits, as I've already been talking about the sort of visual strategies of linking individuals who are not related by blood, like Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius, once we look at the sort of 3 in the middle here, Marcus and his wife Faustina the Younger and their son Commodus, we start to see these other strategies of depicting facial features that make them all look a lot alike, like in a way that's not that unusual, right? You can look at a family photo of, say, probably your own family, and you can see resemblance of, like, oh, I look just like my mother, and oh, my brother looks just like my dad. And, they're doing the same exact thing in portraiture. So with the Antonines, they have this, and you'll see this if you go in the exhibition, like, look closely at the faces, because you'll see that they have this very distinctive style of sort of like heavy eyelids and kind of bags under the eyes, but also these sort of very distinctive bean-shaped pupils. It might be a little tricky to see, but trust me on this. And so, again, though, looking at hairstyles and beard styles, Commodus looks a lot like his dad. So we have, like, bloodline similarities and adoptive, fictive similarities. And then finally we get, I always forget about poor Lucius Verus over here. He's the second choice emperor. He is he's the sort of adoptive, younger brother co-emperor with Marcus. And to really keep it in the family, he winds up being married to Lucilla, again, one of the children of Faustina the Younger and Marcus Aurelius, to sort of solidify those bonds. So again, I point this out just to say that, we really wanted to highlight these stories of dynastic succession, but also how we see this being communicated, both through bloodlines and through sort of fictive means in the portraits in this exhibition. And so, again, as you heard, we landed on this grouping. We have 19 portraits, and what's really remarkable is 11 of these in the exhibition were newly cleaned and conserved for this North American presentation. So still this year, you are among the first people, seeing these. And importantly, 9 of these depict women. And as I said, this was really intentional on our part to really elevate the stories of the imperial women at this time. So you've already heard about the fact that our exhibition designer in Chicago, and this is also done so wonderfully here at the Kimball, really wanted to have these dynamic sort of family groupings here. We wanted it to feel like a family portrait where there is sort of communication and kind of conversation between the figures, and they're so beautifully displayed here again. And so for the remainder of my presentation, I'm going to be talking you through sort of, on the one hand, the art historical approaches we've taken to thinking about how we study and re-identify some of these portraits, with this new data set. As Lisa mentioned, having 622 new works to look at, and just, here, this is 11 of the 19, is just mind-blowing. So how we really sort of approached, our study to these new objects, but also then highlighting a few specific case studies of what came out of our collaborative work with the Torlonia Foundation and their wonderful team of conservators and scholars. So you may have seen, if you've been through the exhibition already, we have a series of formerly known as Imperial women, which feels a bit like formerly known as Prince kind of thing, but this is what we landed on, and I will explain why momentarily. But one of the interesting things is that a lot of these portraits of women, which were identified in the 19th century as imperial women, we have re-identified as portraits of private women of the same period. And so you might be thinking, what does private mean? I mean, quite simply, it means, oops, excuse me, I get so excited. Portraits of people who didn't belong to the imperial family. So basically everybody else. You could be of senatorial class and still have a private portrait. But I want to remind you too that having a portrait, especially in marble or in some other costly material like bronze, was an incredibly high sign of a sign of high social and economic standing. This wasn't just like something that every person could have, or at least a sign of the standing of whoever commissioned this likeness, the idea that they could, buy the marble and pay for a highly skilled sculptor to create a sort of a preferred likeness. And so now many of these portraits, one of the things you'll notice if you look at these faces, let me go back, sorry, is that they look pretty idealized. So one of the challenges of Roman female portraits is that the faces, we might think today of identity sort of being seated in your face, like your face is a huge part of your identity. But for Roman women, they kind of often have there's more of a general look. And this is coming out of, this is purposeful. They sort of are intentionally supposed to resemble female deities. So kind of rounded faces, large eyes, small mouths, typically ageless, maybe some subtle signs of age, but generally pretty ageless. And this was not accidental because to Romans, physical beauty, particularly in women, was really thought to convey an individual's virtues and positive qualities. And there was a term for this. It was called cultus. And it could apply to men too, but it really applied to women. So having carefully styled hair meant like you were in control of yourself as a person. You weren't like a wild barbarian. And so in theory, and this is what is interesting for Romans, it was basically like if you were beautiful on the outside, you were beautiful on the inside too. So that was sort of the way they were operating. And this is why so many Roman women look so goddess-like. Now, one thing I just have to shout out for my absolute favorite object in the Torlonia Collection, and one of my absolute favorite Roman sculptures of all time, the Maiden of Volci. This is something, we see even before the Imperial period of this sort of idealized beauty of these women. And I just want to say, again, she's just so beautifully installed in the exhibition here. You see her right when you come in. So like you have to take a moment to like walk around her and take her in. I was disappointed that my nearly 7-year-old daughter didn't feel the same way I do about this sculpture. But she likes the gods and goddesses, so it's okay. But take a look. This is sort of the beginnings of this. And so in contrast with male portraits produced under the empire, we see, and this is imperial men and private men, we see signs of age to varying degrees. So like with Tony P, you've got like some forehead wrinkles. With some of the other men, you've got like a little bit of a hint of wrinkles around the mouth. Marcus always has these sort of quintessential bags under the eyes. I mean, he's just like trying to hold down the fort. It's a rough time in the late 2nd century. And so all of these 3 emperors come to power in their 40s, and they each rule for about 20 or so years. And what's interesting, though, is that during their regnal years, their faces like don't really age a whole lot. I mean, Marcus like a tiny bit, but like by and large, you don't see 43 and then 65. You see that they are sort of eternally in their 40s. And I like to say that they've found the fountain of middle age, that they like it could be a worse age to stay forever, right? And so I come back to this earlier question about, is this really what they always looked like? And it's like, well, not necessarily. Hadrian late in his life is, I'm trying to think, 65 when he dies. And that, he's still like 43 here. So now, again, hearkening back to earlier traditions and pointing out these super important works in the Torlonia Collection, of course, I don't need to belabor the point of how significant this is after you've already heard from Lisa about this, but just this is coming out of a much earlier tradition of emphasizing signs of age, of deep wrinkles and sagged cheeks as a sign of sort of maturity and knowledge and wisdom gained through a lifetime of experience. But then fast forward just a few decades and you get the first Emperor Augustus, who just like does a 180 and shows himself as eternally youthful throughout his entire reign. So for his more than 40-year reign, and he dies when he's 76, he's kind of like always 25. So, I mean, again, not bad, right? Like goals, but he viewed himself as sort of, this has also had a political component because he's really trying to stress the stability of his rule as sort of, I am ageless, Rome is not changing, it's a golden age. So by the time we get to the 2nd century, it's sort of like a combination of these two. So again, eternally 43. But beyond the faces, the hairstyles, like this is where I get really excited. Like you're never going to look, I hope, at Roman hair again the same way, because I think this is where it is really interesting, is that we get a lot of personal identity and meaning in hairstyles, not unlike how we do today. And so hairstyles, especially for women, is where we see these signs of individuality, that women, while they might wear a style of the time, they often avoid looking like everyone else in the room. And so hairstyles help us date portraits. This is an incredibly useful diagnostic tool. And it's something that I think we visually in society are used to. So, you can look at women's hairstyles from the second half of the 20th century, and I think we can all probably point to these, like set the actors aside, the decades when these styles were worn. So you can be like, oh, that big bouffant curly hair is clearly the 80s, right? And so we get a similar trend when we look at Roman female hairstyles. You can sometimes narrow it down to a decade based on the styles. And I want to make this point too, that, it's not necessarily always about fashion or vanity. Hairstyles, again, like today, can carry meaning. And especially for Roman women, if this might be your only portrait, you want to convey a certain message with your hairstyles. So one other thing I do want to point out with Roman hairstyles, and this is also one we got a lot of questions about. I'm just going to tell you right now, she's wearing a wig. Yes, it looks like a barrister's wig. No, it is not. But she wore a wig. So this is Julia Domna, who was the wife of Emperor Septimius Severus. She was a Syrian princess and a great intellectual, and sort of known as kind of like a philosopher, not empress, but you know what I mean. And so what's interesting is that as scholars, one of the ways that portraits were dated early on was through comparison to coins. And why I'm saying this is because, now it's easy for us in the 21st century to look at a marble portrait and go like, oh yeah, I've looked at tons of these. That's Julia Domna because of her doormat wig. But like in the 17th and 18th centuries, as objects were being excavated, they didn't usually have the inscription that would have named who it was. And so this is where, in that point in time, it was scholars who were sort of doing early work on portraiture were looking to coins that name people. So this is something, we still look at coins for this reason today. So we have Julia Domna, we have her named here. And I want to just point out how we know it's a wig before I get away from this, so you can look for this in the exhibition. It's harder to see on the coin, but she's got these like itty bitty curls that peek out. And here's just a sort of phone pic from Chicago. But like that tells us she's wearing a wig. She's like, look at me in my wig. Here's my real hair. So that is a sign of considerable wealth and status, because you have to remember there's no artificial hair in antiquity. This is someone's real hair, whether it's hers or someone else's. So that is an incredible sign of wealth, and in some extent, like conquest of like being able to get other hair. Now, so kind of coming back to a few case studies here, I really want to point out some of the works in here that we had some really interesting discoveries in this Trajanic group. And again, I want to acknowledge, I kind of alluded to this at the outset, but that so many of these discoveries just really could not have happened until after the works were cleaned and conserved and examined by the amazing conservation team of the Torlonia Foundation, which is led by the wonderful Anna Maria Karuba. And of course, given that Lisa and I were nearly 5,000 miles away from the portraits as they were being cleaned, and while we did make a number of research visits, we couldn't always see the results in real time. So for us, so much of the process for us on the other side of the world was digging into those art historical questions I've already been talking about, of like the faces and the hairstyles and trying to make sense of what's going on there, and then uniting that with the research we'd be receiving and the conservation diagrams from the conservators. And we were also fortunate to receive notes and observations from a series of Italian colleagues, scholars who were also working on the collection. So I just want to also extend a special thanks to Stefania Tuccinardi, Laura Buccino, and Lucilla de Lascianal for their work. And it was really validating when we would see that we were on the same page, like we'd receive notes and it's like, yes, all thinking the same thing. So these two ladies, now these are ones that early on, as we were looking at those Visconti 19th century plates, there were instances where I was looking at them and Lisa can tell you, I was like, I don't know about these two. Like not that they're not good Roman portraits, but that like, I don't know if that's Marciana and Matidia. Like then it's the hair, and I will explain why. So now, of course, these women, as you've already heard, were elevated in Trajanic imagery. And so I have to say this is like the most massive image of this itty bitty teeny tiny cameo, which is like that big, right? But Trajan elevated these imperial women in his imagery. But unfortunately, their marble portraits don't really survive in great numbers. Even their coins, we don't have a ton of. So we really have to rely on like all the little bits we have. And this is really remarkable. I just want to reiterate that Trajan, if I can use the mouse here, we have Trajan, his wife Plotina, his niece Matidia, and then his sister Marciana. That it's all about the women here. And so we have these bits of information we kind of have to piece together. So again, I also want to just remind that when we put our 19th century glasses on and we go back to Visconti days, that we have to recognize that it's 2025. We know a lot more about Roman sculpture now than was known in the 1870s. And that, there's just so much more of a body of scholarship that we can draw on today, and also works that have been found since then. But also recognizing that, the collection was and remains is so expansive that in some of these identifications might have also been really, in a way with the goal of making sure we're completing a set. So as I said, though, again, so few of these women, it could have been hard to know in that moment in the 19th century who they were really looking at. Now, you'll see in the exhibition, and these, of course, are the labels from Chicago. I'm sorry, I didn't have time to get the Kimball ones in. But we kept these names, as I said, these formerly known as, because we recognize that these 19th century identifications are really critical to the history and to the study of these objects. And we didn't want to remove them, because if it just said portrait of a woman, you might be like, why is she here? Like, why are these three ladies with Trajan here? So we wanted to really honor that 19th century history and show why they are grouped with Trajan. Now, Marciana, okay, or not Marciana. There's a telltale feature why this is not Marciana. And once again, it is her hairstyle. It has to do with the braids that are wrapped around her head. Now, this is a style that we see in a lot of other portraits of this time, from about 100 to about 140. And it's a style that scholars refer to today. And sometimes, I'm sorry, guys, we're just like not the most creative. It's called the turban hairstyle, because like it kind of like looks like a turban, but so it wraps around the head. You can see it better here. And what's really critical here to our understanding of Marciana on the left is that this is sort of generally understood to be a style that imperial women did not wear. They wore some things similar to this, but it seems to be a style that was sort of reserved for private women. And there's a model they seem to have been looking to. Now, you heard about Hestia Justiniani / Vesta earlier as this one goddess who's sort of in charge of the hearth, and she has these priestesses known as the Vestal Virgins. Well, the Vestal Virgins had a sort of double whammy of braid-like features. So first, as you see here on their heads, they had a series of bands that wrapped around their head that are called infulae, and it's a fabric band that sort of signifies their sanctity. But beneath that, and we can't quite see it here, but they wore a hairstyle of 6 braids that wrapped around the head. And that was a hairstyle that brides would wear when they were getting married, and it's a sign of chastity. So, of course, they are Vestal Virgins. They need to remain chaste. Now, how does this relate to the average private woman? Well, at this point in the early 2nd century, we're coming into an age where there was sort of a highlighting, like the end of the 1st century, there's an emphasis on morality, especially among women, by Trajan's predecessors, not Nerva, but Domitian. And so it's thought that these women were really trying to display their own sort of moral standards and devotion to the gods by having this sort of priestess-like hairstyle, something that also evoked marital fidelity, maybe not chastity if they were already matrons, but marital fidelity. And so this is a hairstyle that was really worn widely by so many private women. I mean, if you go to Rome and go to the Capitoline, there's so many of these ladies. But, again, it was not worn by imperial women. So coming back to Marciana, it's like, well, what did Marciana wear? Like, okay, fine. So she doesn't wear the turban hairstyle. So when we compare her to the other better known Marcianas, we've got a very different hairstyle happening here. And what's interesting, now I already mentioned wigs. This isn't necessarily a wig, but it could be a separately crafted hairpiece. So try to think of making that in reality. I mean, just like, how do you do that? It's like tubular curls that are flattened, and you've got these like flattened bangs across the forehead. And then, oh, by the way, it also stands up like a diadem, but it's not a diadem. So there's just a whole lot of things happening here. Now, of course, there were very skilled hairdressers in antiquity, as we know from literary sources, but that's something that might be, again, created separately and sort of woven in, sewn in with like thread and pins. And so this is a style that is very specific to certain other women of this time. But again, Marciana never wears the look on the left. I have to say too, I'm so sorry the center image is facing to the left. This makes me absolutely insane. But this is like, they need to be looking the same way. But that was the only image I can find that exists of this sideways. Now, the other thing is just that we get this nest at the back. So again, these amazing names we come up with as scholars, nests and crests and turbans and all the things. So that is a nest, like a bird's nest at the back of her head. That slides to the back. So you've got this like almost regal like diadem in front. And again, we come back to the coins and we know that imperial women wore these, that Marciana wore this, and this was not a style that private women wore. Oh, I'm sorry. Strike that, reverse it. Some private women wore hairstyles like this, but Marciana does not wear that. So anyway, coins help us identify this. Now, finally, again, that was a lot of the art historical work we were doing on our end. And then when we get to the diagram, it's, very validating for us. This was something that came later in the game and to help us understand that the hairstyle was indeed almost entirely ancient. So therefore, this supports the reading of this as a private portrait. So this is where the art historical and the technical come together. This lady, this was another one that I was like, what is going on here, guys? Like, I was very excited about this because it's a not common, it's common, but it's not, as you'll see. So again, thought to be Matidia, the daughter of Marciana. Actual portraits or more sort of well-attested portraits of Matidia have a similar sort of crest thing, kind of like a lunate, like a moon-shaped diadem happening. But just to kind of move along, and you can see, again, similar idea in profile here. Now, to be fair to the Visconti, when you look at the Torlonia Matidia on the left, you can see there's kind of a similarity here. Like, it's in the same family of this look. But what the Torlonia lady has is some other really interesting things going on here. So again, okay, and just to reiterate, coins, Matidia has this same look. We see it in coins, which is why this is probably not Matidia. However, we look at this and look at how it's sort of poofy and braided and there's so many things happening. What's going on here? So we've got the height of Matidia. We've got the braiding of the other ladies. And then we've got a new player in the game. We've got Plotina's sort of beehive poof in front. And so what I think is actually really fascinating here is that this lady is sort of combining like all of the elements of all of the cool, fashionable hairstyles of her time into one. And that she pulled it off well enough that she basically fooled people into thinking like maybe she is actually the wife of an imperial family member. So like kudos to you, mystery woman. And you're really interesting here. I would love to see someone do this in real life, by the way. There is a woman, as an aside, named Janet Stevens, who is a hair archaeologist who recreates Roman hairstyles. We need to see if she can do that. And again, just to sort of reiterate with the conservation diagrams, this one has more restoration to the hair, but the key components are ancient. So again, it really sort of validates this reading as private. Now, we just already heard about Plotina briefly, and I want to say this is an interesting portrait in that it is the only full-length portrait of a woman in the show, which is also kind of curious because there are very few marble portraits of Plotina that survive. And now Lisa and I were very fortunate. We had the opportunity to examine this portrait in the labs with Professor Carlo Gaspari, again, who has worked on the collection for decades. And we saw this before cleaning and during cleaning, and then eventually we saw it again later after. And that was a really illuminating experience. Now, once again, we're getting sort of differences in hairstyles. What's interesting is Plotina has a diadem, not this poof. And so it's like, for us looking at this, the question is this a new type? Is this like the only example where we don't have that, but it's sort of replaced with an actual sort of, tiara-like diadem? In her coinage, we see both. We see hair and a diadem. So it's like, what's happening here? And then when we actually look at Plotina closely, now look really closely at the head. And I was saying yesterday when we did our AV check, I'm like, this is the biggest I've ever seen this head. This is amazing. There are so many cracks and breaks and there's sort of subtle abrasions, but yet there are also elements that seem very sort of finished and crisp, like her lower face seems very complete. Her nose is restored on the end, but, still pretty complete in the middle. So we were really puzzling over this. I have to say, looking at it when it was not cleaned yet, of like, what is happening here? Is this ancient and put back together? Are there ancient and modern components that sort of restored it to completion? Is this modern and has been sort of, sort of roughed up a little to give it a sort of antiquated appearance. And this is again where I just want to stress how central the conservators are to the story, because, again, you need both aspects of it to sort of get to a conclusion. And so I want to just, one more image. Again, you can really see all of these different breaks. It's a really challenging object. And what we ultimately learned through the conservators' work is that the head is fully modern. So even though it is in a series of, there are sort of different cracks and pieces there, that it all appears to have been created, again, probably in the 18th century. And it's interesting when we think about that, of this idea that there are certain elements that suggest ancient wear on it. And what is the purpose of that? Probably to sort of camouflage or blend the ancient and modern components. So again, like, every object here has a really fascinating story, and you need both sides of the scholarship to get there. And then finally, to round out the group, we're going to look at, last but not least, Emperor Trajan. I have ladies first. And so, like so many of the portraits, this is one we thought was going to have an ancient head and a modern bust, and this was sort of the prevailing interpretation for some time. But look at the tombstone. It is 17th to 18th century. And so that is a very new dating of this object. And what's interesting, again, is, like I said, we thought maybe modern bust. It looks very complete, very clean, very nicely carved. The face, the surface is a little different. So, okay, probably ancient head on a modern bust. But, nope. And I will say, that was something that I think was an interesting discovery. But it's not like want, now what are we going to do? It was actually a really interesting moment for us in thinking about. It just reiterates that I think, work on this collection is ongoing, and, no pun intended, we're really still scratching the surface on it and making these discoveries. And this is why it's so critical to have this ongoing examination and sort of reconsideration of these works. And so this was also, as Lisa alluded to earlier, we had some kind of, this was one of the couple of sort of late changes. And so we didn't get to see it one more time in Rome before it came here to Chicago. And so once it got here, we were so eager to look at, let's see, what are we looking at? And then once it got here, it was like, I get it now. And so there's a couple things that were just stand out of why this feels early modern and not part ancient. So one, look at that forehead. I'm just going to say it right now. So it projects out in a way that's unusual. And while we have other images of Trajan, it's a little rounded. I mean, this is very, topographical, if you will. So it's the best way I could describe it. I don't know. And so, not quite the way his forehead normally looks. Okay, fine. So that's one. Then we get to his nose. Now, as you've seen, of course, many of the noses, just by nature, not just portraits, but so many of the sculptures, their noses are broken, because when things fall, that's the projecting element that breaks. When you look closely, this is not actually a repair of the tip of the nose. That's actually just a different surface sort of treatment there. So it's unusual that the nose is actually fully complete. So that was a little bit of a tip off. Not tip off the nose, but just tip off. Anyway, so, but noses don't survive like this necessarily all the time in ancient sculptures. And again, just for comparison's sake with the other two ladies, most of the face is okay, just the nose. Now, then, as we keep going around the head, I have to say, I've never looked at ears so much in my life on Roman sculptures until we started looking more at this guy. But it's the drilling, this is going to sound weird, it's the drilling of the ear canal. And I looked at that and I was like, oh, that's weird. And I say this here, not weird, but just not ancient Roman approach necessarily. And just to give an example of what I'm saying is, if you look at Hadrian, which would be, immediately after Trajan chronologically, there's no drilling of the ear canal. This is not what Roman sculptors do. And we can look at our friend Marciana here again and see the same thing. But interestingly, I was so tickled. We were in the galleries here yesterday, up in the permanent galleries. And I was I saw the Canova head, which of course I'm going to gravitate to because it's a marble sculpture. And I looked at the side of her head and I was like, Lisa, come look at the ear, which is probably, no one's ever probably said that in that gallery. I'm like, come over. And it's the same type of drilling. So it's just, these are the quirky diagnostic things that we're looking at when we're trying to make reattributions, whether it's names or dating. We're looking at all of everything. It's not just the hair, it's not just the face, it's the ears too. And then finally, kind of going around the head, one last thing was the hairstyle. And this was something that maybe on the surface, it's looks like hair, right? But when you look at Trajan's portraits, and I'm apologies for the black and white images. Unfortunately, not a lot of people always publish the back of heads, so it's tricky to get back of head pictures. But the way that individual strands of hair are carved is quite different. That these are sort of thicker locks that are very well defined on the left. And this was something that I will say, once we de-installed the objects in Chicago, it was actually a really nice opportunity. We got them down, we got raking light on them, so we could see the tops of the head in a way that we just didn't get to explore when we were installing the exhibition. And you can see it's like a radiate, it's like a sun, you know? And when you look over the top of his head, it's got this same technique. And again, it's not bad carving at all. It's beautifully carved. It's just a different approach than what we've seen with how Roman sculptors will often do, like every little individual like lock of hair. And so I point this out just to say that, again, so much of this, you know, some of the changes were late breaking, some were early in the game, but all of this comes together collaboratively. And so I just want to conclude by really, again, encouraging you to go to the galleries, look closely at these portraits, spend time with them. You know, they feel like family after a while when you look at them so much. And it's really just been such a great honor and privilege to, again, work on this exhibition, to collaborate with the foundation and with the Kimball. And I think you can see there's still so much to consider and explore. And we really hope you just, you know, take in every moment of these spectacular, amazing objects. Thank you.